This is Amanda Edwards, and I'd like to welcome you to the Edwards Empowerment Talks. This podcast provides a platform to empower individuals and the community by showcasing stories of resilient people who have refused to let life's challenges prevent them from achieving their dreams. The Edwards Empowerment Talks will also highlight the work being done in the community that will help to positively shift the trajectory of this nation. Through stories of adversity, perseverance, drive, struggle, and success, the podcast will empower others to believe in their dreams and pursue those dreams despite whatever challenges may come their way. It is also a vehicle to equip the community with the tools necessary to be the change they want to see. I welcome you to tune in. You don't want to miss this. Hi, and welcome to our next episode of the Edwards Empowerment Talks. We love to use the personal stories and the work that people have done in the community to inspire others to do the same. This week, we have a very special guest, the Honorable Curtis Graves. Curtis Graves was a civil rights leader as well as a state legislator and has done a tremendous amount to make sure that our communities not only were desegregated, but that we were able to live in the communities that we deserve. I am so thrilled to have him here today to share his wisdom with us, to give us some of his advice, but also to share a part of history that's not so well known. Many people don't know the story of the desegregation of Houston, and certainly some of the ins and outs that he had to go through to make sure that we were getting the rights and the access that we deserve. And so I am so thrilled he was willing to accept my invitation to join us. So, Mr. Graves, thank you for being here.
Please call me Curtis.
Okay, well, I didn't know if you're going to ask me to call you the Honorable.
No.
Well, thank
That's
you.
That's a long story. I did make somebody do that one time.
So maybe we'll have some time for that story.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good. Very good. Well, you know, I came across your story when I learned about the desegregation of Houston. I'm a lifelong Houstonian. Of course, I've spent some time outside of Houston, but grew up here and thought I knew a little bit about my history. But it wasn't until I watched a program called The Strange Demise of Jim Crow that I learned the details of the undertold story of Houston desegregation and the leadership that was really involved behind the scenes in making that happen. And you, Curtis, happen to have been one of those leaders. And I would love to learn about your journey and let you share that story so that people understand that sometimes those with whom we end up aligning are sometimes some of our strangest bedfellows, if you will. And so seeing how we were able to accomplish so much and with the leadership like leaders like you, I think will be very inspiring for our listeners and our viewers. So without further ado, before you became Curtis, the civil rights leader, and Curtis, the legislator, tell us a little bit about your background growing up. I know that you were from New Orleans, and so you had to make a trek over to Houston. And so share a little bit about your background growing up in New Orleans and how you ended up in Houston.
Well, to start with, most people don't like to go back this far, but my great-grandparents were enslaved in Louisiana on a plantation called the Whitney Plantation, which is now open to the public. And I would encourage those of you who are visiting the New Orleans area, it's about 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. And both my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather on my mother's side were born on that plantation, both the children of the slave masters, if you will. The slave master from the next plantation over fathered my great-grandmother, and an overseer on the plantation who was the brother of the owner of the plantation fathered my great-grandfather. So I have a long history that goes right back into slavery. My the very proud part of this story is that my great-grandmother was in 1862 purchased by her white half-brother and brought to his plantation and freed almost immediately But where did you go? What did you do? How did you earn a living? So she went to work as a housekeeper in his home,
Mm-hmm.
although that was his sister. And she got a husband eventually by 1865.
Mm-hmm.
And the two of them worked on that plantation, although slavery was over with, as domestic servants. Between 1865 and 1872, they had saved the grand sum of $700
Wow.
as people who were formerly slaves. And he sold them a portion of land facing the Mississippi River that was 144 feet wide and 4 miles deep. You hear what I'm saying?
Okay.
144 feet wide
Mm-hmm.
and 4 miles deep,
Okay.
which means that they owned a plantation.
Yeah.
My father was in business for himself with his brother-in-law. They owned two service stations in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was civil rights down to the bone. I
Okay.
mean, down to the bone.
Okay.
When Jackie Robinson came to town, my dad took me to get his autograph. When
Mm-hmm.
A. Philip Randolph came to town, my dad was on the local board of directors of the NAACP in New Orleans. When A. Philip Randolph came to town, my dad took me to meet A. Philip Randolph. Now, and I've thought about this many times, and I don't know the answer because my father's dead now. When we walked up, A. Philip Randolph said, "Buddy," as if he knew him. So undoubtedly, he knew him. How many people in today can say that a Supreme Court justice actually slept in their bed? I can.
Wow.
Thurgood Marshall actually slept in my bed.
Wow. So
My
when
dad,
mom and dad said, "We need you to make room for somebody," did they tell you it was going to be at the
well, he didn't even know he was
he didn't
Thurgood
know he
Marshall
was
at the
going to
time.
be, yes,
Oh, no,
exactly.
no, he didn't even know he was Thurgood Marshall at the time. He just was an attorney, defended the NAACP.
Yeah.
Anyway, he came to town, my dad, because my dad was involved with the NAACP. He came to town, and they didn't have places to stay. The only little hotels that were owned were rented out by the hour, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
So they stayed with people like that came to town. They stayed with families, and
Mhm.
one of the families they stayed with was mine. I slept on the sofa in the living room, and he slept in my bedroom. And I didn't remember it. I must have been 7, 8 years old. And when Thurgood was nominated for the Supreme Court, my father called me. I was then in Houston. My father called me and said, "Do you remember when he slept in your bed?" And I said, "You mean the soon to be Justice Thurgood Marshall slept in my bed?" And he said, "Yes, he did sleep in your bed." He said, "You got to remember him, tall, light skinned guy, told a lot of jokes, loved your mama's cooking."
Uh,
And I said, "Well, no, well, I do remember a guy like that, but I didn't know it was Thurgood Marshall." My dad said he didn't know he was Thurgood Marshall either. So that's where I
right.
got that line from my dad.
Yeah. Well.
Anyway, he said he loved your mom's cooking. And I said, "Oh, so about maybe 10 years later, 15 years later, I'm living in Washington, D.C., and a mutual friend of Thurgood's and mine, who was a lawyer, died. And I went to the wake the night before the funeral, and he was there.
Yeah.
And I waited my turn to speak to him, and I explained to him that whose son I was, and I said, "You came to my house to spend a night, maybe 3 or 4 times." And I said, "Do you remember Joseph Graves, my father?" And he said, I could see in his face that he didn't remember. And then I said, "Well, you were brought to our house by A.P. Tureaud, and we lived in a
Mhm.
tall white house." And all of a sudden, I saw him smiling, and he said, "Man, your mama could cook."
So he remembered.
And I said, "The woman is still cooking like that today." And he said, "I got to get me a ticket to New Orleans and go and check that food out." My dad had passed away by that time, but my mom was still cooking good stuff. Anyway,
Good.
so I came from a family where politics was talked about around the table.
Yeah.
I was essentially the only child of my mom and dad, although I was raised with a cousin girl who came to live with us when I was a young fellow. So I was essentially the smallest child in the house,
Mm-hmm.
and they talked about politics all the time. So in order for me to have something to say, I had to listen very carefully and be able to add something. So there wasn't a night that we didn't watch Huntley Brinkley. There wasn't a night that we were not involved in the whenever my dad said, when the polls open, you show up. No matter what, no matter if people are running for dog catcher, you go and vote for that dog catcher.
So it was
So
ingrained in you in an early age that
exactly,
political and civic participation was not optional.
it was not optional. When it was time for me to vote, when I turned 21, a few days before that, my dad called me in and said, "We need to have a talk." And I said, "About what?" He said, "Well, you're going to have to register to vote in a few days. You're going to turn 21." And I said, "Okay, I'll go and register to vote." He said, "No, son, you're going to sit down and listen to what I have to say." And I said, "What? About what? About what?" So he said, "Now, I want you today to go and shine your best shoes." He said, "I want you to get your best suit out. I
Mm-hmm.
want you to have your tie that matches that suit, and a nice white shirt for you to wear when you go and register to vote." And I said, "Well, Daddy, why do I need all of this?" And he
Mm-hmm.
said, "Because, son, if they think that you are not someone that they don't want to vote, you will not pass the test." And I said, "I don't really understand what you're telling me." So he
Mm-hmm.
said to me, number one, on the voter registration office opens at 9 o'clock in the morning. You need to be standing at the door at 5 minutes to 9,
Mm.
and because you want to get there before anybody else is in the office. And I said, "Okay." And he said, "You want to look like somebody who would know how to cast a vote, because if you don't, they're going to try to find a way not to allow you to register."
Mm-hmm.
So sure enough, that morning I showed up at 5 minutes to 9, and I was standing there with my shine shoes, my best suit, my tie on.
And matching tie.
And he said to me, "If it's a man, you say yes, sir, every time they say anything. And if it's a woman, you say yes, ma'am, every time they say anything." And I said, "Okay." So I went in, and a woman looks like Lily Tomlin. She had that look on her face with the
Mm-hmm.
big hair and the
Mm-hmm.
and a mean look. And she said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I'd like to register to vote, ma'am." And she said, "Okay." So she kind of throws me a clipboard, and she said, "Are you a Democrat or Republican?" And I said, "I'm a Democrat." My dad had already warned me, if I did not say I was a Democrat, I would not be able to vote in the state of Louisiana,
Oh, wow.
because everybody was a Democrat.
Yeah. That
So,
was
and the
before the
only vote
realignment.
that you could cast would be for president if you didn't register as a Democrat.
Mm.
Well, we were always Democrats, so I registered as a Democrat. So I um, I filled out the paper. She looked at it. She, I guess, agreed with what was on it, and then she opened the book, and she turned to a page, and she said, "Read that." And I said, and I read it, and then she said, "What did you read?" And I said, "It was the preamble to the Constitution of the United States of America. It sets out in its first paragraph." And by the time I got the first paragraph, she reached underneath the counter with a big old stamp, and she hit that thing and said, "Passed."
So you
And
had to wait. So let's pause.
all right.
As a precondition for you to be able to register to vote, you're telling me that you had to not only read the preamble of the United States Constitution, but then engage in basically some type of reading comprehension quiz of sorts.
No, let's go back further than that. She could have picked any paragraph in the book. The book was the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
She could have picked any paragraph in that book. Or as a matter of fact, she could have picked any paragraph in any book
Mm-hmm.
and shown it to me, and I would have had to read it, comprehend it, and explain to her what it was. So it was totally a subjective test.
Completely up to her
Hence,
discretion.
hence, shined shoes,
Mm-hmm.
nice shirt, tie that matched, huh? Because I had to look like somebody who could cast an intelligent vote, or she could have said, no matter what I said as explaining the preamble to the Constitution, she could have said, "Well, you did not explain it. I'm sorry, but you didn't pass."
Wow.
So I had to look the part,
Yeah.
and I had to be the part, and
Yeah.
I had to be intelligent enough to hang in there to convince her that I was the part. I was
What
a
year was
voter.
this? What year was this?
This was let's see, 38, 48, uh, 49. That
So
was
in
no
1940,
38, 48, 58. That was 59,
1959. This
19
is
and 59. Yeah.
wow, 1959. This is what things looked like, and then people question why there was such an urgency to create, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and all of the things that people
But
like you were involved in much later.
when I got to Houston, there was a poll tax.
Well, wait a
You
minute. Wait a minute. How did you get to Houston?
Well, I'll tell you that story in a minute.
Okay, so that's a different
But
story.
I'm
But tell
saying
us
that
about this poll tax. Okay.
not only was there a literacy test in Louisiana and in many of the southern states, there was a poll tax in many of the southern states. That Louisiana didn't have one; it had just the literacy test.
Yes.
And the poll tax again, you had to pay to register to vote.
That's right.
And I remember there was a guy named George Nelson who was in Houston who was a barber, and he used to have a sign above his barber chair that says, "If you don't pay your poll tax, you can't talk politics in my barber shop."
Wow.
So so
Wow.
so when I got to Houston, I can't remember whether it was $2 or $5, but you had to pay a poll tax in order to register to vote. So how did
Wow.
I get to Houston?
Yes. How did you get to Houston?
I went to Xavier because that's what good Catholic boys do in New Orleans. I had graduated from a Catholic school, gone to Catholic elementary.
What high
And
school did you go to for
I went to
anybody who
Xavier
knows
Prep.
anything about New Orleans high schools? Okay.
Xavier Prep.
Got it.
It is now an all girls school,
Okay.
and subsequently it's been changed to Catherine Drexel High School in New
Okay.
Orleans. It's an all girls school now.
Hmm.
Anyway, I went to Xavier Prep and graduated, and I wanted to. I thought I wanted to go into mathematics, and I went to Xavier, majoring in math, and I wasn't doing that good in math, and it was really because Xavier Prep didn't give me the prerequisites that I needed in order to survive as a mathematician. I didn't have calculus. I didn't have trigonometry. I didn't have all of those things. And there were youngsters who had gone to St. Augustine's High School in New Orleans who had all of those things.
Hmm.
So I was making C's, and I should have been making A's in math.
Hmm.
And I went into the dean called me in at the end of my sophomore year, and she said, "Mr. Graves, you're not doing too well in math, and maybe you ought to get out of college and do something with your hands."
Oh,
This was
wow.
a nun I never forgot named Sister Francis. In other words, you should be a laborer. You
Mm.
hear what I'm saying?
Hmm.
A white nun told me to be a laborer because I wasn't doing well in math. Not you ought to change your major, not
Yeah.
you ought to
Just get out of school.
get out of school. So I thanked her. I was polite. I I I left her office, went to the registrar's office and got my transcript and asked them to seal it. They did, and put a little stamp on it so that I couldn't open it. I said, I'm changing schools. I went home. I had my transcript in my hand, and I went to Baton Rouge and met with Dr. Higgins, and he suggested to me that if I wanted to go into business administration, which is the field that I thought I wanted to go into then, he said, you probably ought to go to Texas Southern or to Tennessee State. And I said, I'm driving my 51 Mercury, so I have to drive to either Tennessee or to Texas. I said, Doc, which one is the closest? And he said, Houston is closest. I said, I think I'd like to go to Texas Southern.
So whichever is closest.
Literally, that's what brought me to Texas Southern. So I got in my 51. Oh, he called the registrar and he said, I got a bright young man that you would love to have at Texas Southern, and I'm sending him with his transcript in his hand from Xavier University, and I think you need to accept him. And the registrar, who I didn't know then, said, send him this way. So the 2 days later, I registered at Texas Southern University, and the rest is history.
Well, tell us, that's extraordinary. Now, tell us how you made the rest history. When you got to Texas Southern, did you know you were going to become the civil rights leader? Were you there to do that?
No,
How did you?
no, I attended
Because
my
you walked
class.
into a segregated. It was segregated in Houston upon your arrival, and
Absolutely.
you thought you were going there for academics, I assume, and
Right.
somehow, some kind of way, you not only finished your academic career there, but you also began a totally different type of career in being an activist and a civil rights leader, and eventually getting into public service. So tell us how you stepping foot at TSU onto TSU's campus began that journey for you.
Well, I registered Texas Southern. I stayed in the dormitory 2 days.
Okay.
They were both traumatic days. The first night, somebody in the next room played his saxophone all night long, and the second night, somebody in my room played dominoes all night long, and I moved out the next day.
All right. All right. So he
So
knows
I
where to kind of.
found I found a roommate named Otis King. Does
Okay.
that name ring a bell to you at all?
Yes, because I'm familiar with the story, but go ahead.
Aha! I found a roommate named Otis King, and Otis was a law student in Texas at Texas Southern at the time, and Otis and I became roommates.
Okay.
And um, within a year or so, I found out about a meeting that was being held in the administration building about demonstrating against the segregated lunch counters.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to the meeting one day at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And L. Drewy Stearns is the person who was a law student also,
Mm-hmm.
who was chairing the meeting. And he had had an experience in Houston that was that caused him, that pushed him in the direction of doing something. He was driving along the street one night, minding his own business, and the police pulled him over. They said, "Let me see your license plate, boy, your license, boy." And he opened up his wallet, and they're shining the light in the wallet, and they saw the picture of a white girl. And they said, "Get out of the car." And they arrested him.
This law
Essentially,
student for having a picture
a
of a white
picture
woman in
of a
his
white
wallet.
girl. His undergraduate degree was at Michigan, and he had known this white lady girl had gone to Michigan with him and had a picture in his wallet. Well, they roughed him up, took him to jail, and the next day or so he got out, and he went to city council and
Mm-hmm.
complained about the treatment that he got, and he wasn't satisfied with what city council had to say. Quentin Meese was the guy who was the Y director, and he told Quentin about this. And Quentin said to him, "Why don't you do something about it?" Well, that was the spark in his mind that caused him to go to Texas Southern and organize some people that would walk down Wheeler Avenue down to Alameda, where there was a wine garden store. Now, if you're not familiar with wine gardens, they're closed, but they were the predominant grocery store chain in the Houston area at the time. And they had a lunch counter. As soon as you walked in the front door to your left, there was a long lunch counter there where white patrons could come in and have a coffee or a hamburger or a soda or whatever they wanted. And it was not available to blacks. The interesting thing about that is, and if wine gardens would have been thinking about it, they would have done something about this. This was a black neighborhood.
Yeah.
And even in a black neighborhood, they did not allow black people to sit down at a counter in the black neighborhood where they were trying to sell them groceries.
Wow.
Well, 12 of us gathered at the flagpole at Texas Southern, walked down to Alameda and Wheeler, and walked into that wine garden store. And as we had called the press in advance because we had decided that the press would be our protection,
Mm-hmm.
because if the newspapers, the television people were there, it was unlikely that the police, we thought the police department was going to be our problem. The police department would be less likely to beat us up if the newspapers and the TV people were there. So we got there, we were impatient, we were youngsters, and we said, well, we going in anyway. And we went in,
Mm-hmm.
and we sat down at all the stools at the news counter, at the lunch counter, and immediately they shut it down. Did not serve the white people or us
So they
anything.
shut the whole restaurant down.
No, they shut the whole, yeah, they shut down the lunch counter.
Okay.
The next day we went and they shut the whole store down.
Okay. So day two, they shut the whole thing down. No press on day two, right?
No, on day one we did have some press, but it was when we were walking out because
Okay.
we tried to get it done. Didn't work that way. Anyway, the next 2 days later, what they did was they taped off that whole area.
Well,
So
let
they
me
shut
let
the
me
lunch.
pause. Hold on. So why did y'all want to take that approach? Is it because of what you were seeing happening nationally, in terms of other sit-ins, or tell me what made you say, or what made the group say these, let's do a sit-in at Wine Gardens.
Well, sit-ins had kind of started in Greensboro and places like that. And
Mm-hmm.
we had seen those things on television and decided that we wanted to try to get a sit-in started in the Houston area,
Mm-hmm.
because there was no possibility of us eating at any restaurant, sitting down at any lunch counter anywhere in the city, because it was whites only.
Mm-hmm.
So the easiest, you got to take the easiest way out. The easiest thing for us to do was to walk to Wine Gardens
Mm-hmm.
and to sit in at that lunch counter.
Okay.
Well, Wine Gardens approach 2 days later was to rope off the lunch counter and shut it down forever. Well, we said, we held a press conference in front of Wine Gardens and said nobody should shop at Wine Gardens until they open the lunch counter to us.
Wow.
Well, Mother's Day was very close, and sure enough, nobody shopped at Wine Gardens on Mother's Day. That got Wine Gardens' attention.
Yes.
But we had also um, gotten the attention of many people at Texas Southern who wanted to participate. So since Wine Gardens was shut down, the next closest location where there was a white-only lunch counter was the Madding's drugstore, which
Okay.
was the other way on Alameda.
Okay.
So 2, 3 Saturdays after the first sit-in, we sat in at Madding's drugstore.
Okay.
I was in the first group. By this time, we had gone to Dr. Bill Lawson, who is still with us today. God
Yes.
bless him. And approached Dr. Lawson and asked him whether he would train us in civil rights.
Now wait a minute. Now what at that time, Dr. Lawson was newer to town and was much younger. And tell us, what role did he play back then in terms of engagement with young students? Tell us a little bit about what his standing was, because we know him today to be someone who is one of our wise elders and a leader who has been tried and true for many, many decades now. But of course, what was he like? What was his role back then?
He was the minister of the Black Student Union on Texas Southern's campus, had
Okay,
been employed by Texas Southern to be the Baptist student minister.
got it.
And so he was close to us.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a house that literally was right on the track as you cross Wheeler, leaving the campus. To the left was his house, so he was close. So we, so
Mm-hmm.
we went to Dr. Lawson and said, we need training in nonviolence, because none of us had ever experienced anything like this before, and we expected to be attacked by the policemen or thugs or somebody. We wanted to be equipped so that we would be in sync with what Dr. King was doing, because he was preaching nonviolence.
So you had
So
bought into Dr. King's teachings of nonviolence and wanted to
exactly.
know how to
And
properly use
we
that.
thought that the best route for us to achieve the desegregation that we were trying to get done at the lunch counters was to practice the same nonviolence that Dr. King was pushing.
Okay.
I mean, we can tell that by what we see in the streets today.
That's a vicious
If you
cycle.
start off with a violent approach, somebody will come back at you with violence. And nonviolence is a very moving and very effective use of a way to get the job done without anybody getting hurt.
That's right.
If you get hurt, it will cause what has happened with George Floyd. And George Floyd was a lesson for the world. And I think that most people don't understand that when John Lewis was beaten in the head and when he crossed the Edmund Pettit Bridge, that was the first time that national television had ever seen something like that. It seen black people being beat up just to ask for the right to vote.
Yes.
George Floyd was the first time that we had ever seen a public execution on national television.
That's what it was.
A public execution. It was just like he was beheaded. That knee on his neck killed him just as well as a blade would have if he'd gone through the guillotine.
What a powerful statement.
It's important that we understand that the sight of life being drained out of George Floyd galvanized the whole world.
That's correct.
Because we had never in the history of the nation seen on national television somebody's life being squeezed out of them in a public execution before. Well, anyway, but meanwhile, back at the story. We went to Dr. Lawson. He gave us some rudimentary training, but the thing that stuck into my mind was never hit back. Take whatever they have to give you. If it takes giving up your life, maybe this is something that is worth the cause. And that stuck with me. It really did. So that Saturday morning, we had mobilized some 200 students at Texas Southern to go in, and with more people than there were stools. So
so this is
we had
bigger
to
than the
figure a
group
way
of...
to rotate students on to the campus so that everybody would feel like they had participated in the movement.
This is bigger than that group of 14 you described.
Absolutely.
Going in for the first time.
By 2 weeks down the road, we had a lot of kids who wanted to be part of the movement.
Okay.
And so I was in the first wave. And I arrived there, I guess, 9:30 in the morning we had counted the stools. So we knew exactly how many people we needed to fill every stool to shut down the lunch counter. So we all arrived in separate cars and we walked in. And again, we had called the press because, again, we thought the press would be our salvation. And I guess the press called the police department because the police department arrived not too long after we were there. But let me get to the first part of the story. So we went in, we occupied all the stools, and there was a glass that went from one end of the lunch counter to the other. So a mirror, so that I could see exactly what was going on behind me and around me. Well, we were sitting there, and they immediately they shut the lunch counter down, and essentially all the ladies who were working behind the lunch counter sat back and would not serve us or would not ask us anything. They were just standing there. And a group of I guess white thugs, today we'd call them skinheads. They all had leather jackets on, and they came in from my right, and I could see them in the mirror, as they all came in. This is the guys. Nothing changes with the big tattoos on their arms and the tattooed faces and the too many earrings and you know. So they came in and stood behind us,
Mm-hmm.
and it was at that moment that Dr. Lawson came to life inside me,
Hmm.
because it was at that moment that I reached the crisis where I said to myself that if I have to give my life for this cause, it's worth it.
Wow. And you literally had that feeling.
I had the feeling that I might be knifed in the back.
Wow.
And I said to myself, I'm not going to fight back. I'm going to look forward. We had books with us, by the way, just in case we had to sit there all day long with our books.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna turn around. I'm not gonna fight back. I'm gonna take whatever comes my way because the cause is bigger than me.
Wow. That's powerful. And to have had that consciously cross your mind and you have to think about it and make a decision in that moment because you could have turned around and said, what do you, excuse me? You know, it could have been a totally different engagement.
It could have been a different thing. Well, just as the last thug came in, a police officer with a white cap on
Mm-hmm.
came through the door. And he did not say a word to them, nor them to him, nor to us. But he walked all the way through the store to the back between us and them. And then he walked back to the door. And then he turned around and he walked back towards the back of the store. And by the time he got halfway to the back of the store again, they started peeling out of the door.
Hmm.
It looked like a command officer, so there must have been other police officers outside. And as I left the store, I saw that there were maybe 10 or 15 police officers there. But he decided, I guess, to diffuse the situation
Mm-hmm.
with just his presence.
Mm-hmm.
And he did. So essentially, we spent, they eventually all peeled out and went. I was told later that they were from Galveston,
Mm-hmm.
that they had heard that there would be a sit-in at Madding's drugstore,
Mm-hmm.
and that they had come in to break it up.
Hmm.
Okay? Well, it's
Mm-hmm.
just like those guys who showed up in Michigan at the governor's office. They were told to break it up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so nothing really changes, does it?
Wow. Yeah.
Anyway,
And history repeats itself.
history repeats itself. And if you don't read history, you might repeat it more than you think.
That's right.
Anyway, they walked away, and we stayed there an hour or so, and then our contingent left, and another contingent came, and we occupied the seats there until Maddings closed the drugstore,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the end of that one. Well, we consistently escalated to other stores.
Okay.
And the third store was a Henke and Pilox, I think, store, which was on Alameda also. And that happened to be on a Friday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it just happened that I was the person who was the lead at that store. And I drove in with several people, and there were 2, 3 carloads of us, and we were going to close down the lunch counter. Well, when I got there, there were a lot of cameras.
Mm-hmm.
The police was there. We walked in, and they had already put a tape around the lunch counter.
So they were ready.
Well,
They were ready.
they were ready.
Mm-hmm.
So I jumped the tape and snatched it down. And I
Uh-oh.
told everybody with me, occupy a seat.
Uh-huh.
And they all did. Well, I didn't know that NBC was a part of that group
Okay.
of reporters. And that made the Huntley Brinkley show that night. And my parents saw it.
So your parents saw you. So you said it made the news. So it makes the news that night
Right.
on NBC and nationally. And mom and dad at home in New Orleans see their son, who's supposed to be at Texas Southern getting his education and is now leading a movement of this sort.
My mom and dad saw me tear the tape down.
Oh, they saw you tear the tape down. Uh-oh.
They saw me invite all of my friends in and instruct them to occupy all the seats. So
Oh,
my so I'm at my apartment with Otis King that afternoon, and the phone rang,
your roommate.
and it was my mom, and she said, Curtis, and I said yes, and I could tell it was a stern voice, and she said, your dad needs to talk to you, and he is angry. And I said, okay. And she put him on the phone, and the first thing was son. And I had heard that son before, so I knew that that was not a good son. And he said, son, he said, your mom and I sent you to Houston to get an education. He said, you are just about to get yourself killed. He said, those white folks would kill you doing the things that you think that you're doing the right thing. He said, this is not a good idea. He said, you need to stop this now.
Wow.
Well, I didn't say anything for it was maybe 15 seconds, but it sounded like it was an hour. I didn't
Yeah.
say anything for a few seconds because I was collecting my thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, but Dad, you raised me to do this.
Uh-oh.
And he
So the
said,
truth comes
he's,
back to dad.
I said, you raised me to do this. And then he didn't say anything for several seconds. And then all of a sudden, a conciliatory voice said, I understand.
Wow.
So the tide had turned
That's right.
because he then realized that this was something that I had to do because he had raised me to do this.
He raised you to have a sense greater than self and to further the cause and the missions
Exactly.
that he was fighting for. And it was passing the torch to your generation to now begin your leg of the fight.
Thurgood did not sit at the table for nothing.
That's right.
And all of the people who sat at the table, at our table, and talked politics didn't do it for nothing because he had raised a child that felt like this was a cause that was bigger than him.
Mm-hmm.
And from then on, he was my biggest supporter.
Wow.
He
That's
called
powerful.
me. He called me one day from the service station. Called me one afternoon because he wanted to catch me when my mom wasn't there. And he said, I don't want any surprises. He said, so when you're doing something, you let me know. And I need to know what's going on because I need to know how to protect your mom.
Mm.
Because he was afraid that she would,
Mm-hmm.
go off the deep end and try to get him to stop me. Well, from then on, I called him
Mm-hmm.
and I did discuss things like this with him. And I
Mm-hmm.
told him that I was going to do this, that, or the other. And even when I got into politics in Houston, I would call him from time to time and just run something by him to let him know that, look, this might be a little dangerous, but I just want you to know what I'm doing and
And
why
that's
I'm doing it.
and that's important, I think, for uh, that relationship, for our relationships with the adults in our lives to be able to evolve in that way. And I think that that's really moving. I want to make sure we get to a couple of items. One, the work that you were doing as students with these sit-ins and trying to push for desegregation fit into a broader piece of the puzzle, which was that in Houston you had business leaders that were meeting, white business leaders that were meeting with black business leaders, and they happened to make the students a topic of discussion. So can you share a little bit about the instances in which there were other entities that would open up, namely the department stores, for example, that were opening up as part of these strange bedfellows aligning and them saying, well, those students over there, we'll make sure that they're present on TV when you've got the big parade coming up, for example. And can you share one of those examples of how that was happening and the notion that all of this was happening under the radar? In other words, there was a media blackout that had been agreed to, in which the media was purposely not covering what you all were doing, in an effort to maybe keep it nonviolent, but then also to keep it on terms with the business community. Can you share a little bit about that?
Well,
And then I want to ask you about Dr. King in a minute.
Let me share one other story first.
Sure.
In order for us to continue this at Texas Southern, we had to get there had to be some buy-in by the university.
Yes.
Because in many universities, they expel the students who got involved in the sit-ins. So what happened was that about the fourth week in, the mayor of the president of Texas Southern was Dr. Samuel Nabrit, whose brother was Dr. Jim Nabrit, who was president of Howard University, who was a classmate of Thurgood Marshall, who helped Thurgood Marshall write many of the briefs. And Marshall and Jim Nabrit had talked to Sam Nabrit and kind of given him the courage to empower us. So Dr. Nabrit called an all-university assembly about 3 or 4 weeks into our demonstrations. And he came on the stage, and there was not anything on the stage except a podium and a microphone in the middle of the stage. And he came in and he walked up to the microphone, and literally the place was packed. People were hanging out of the door. And he said, "Thank you for coming. Mrs. Nabrit and I are very comfortable. I don't need this job. Primarily, you are citizens of the United States of America, and secondarily, you are students of Texas Southern University.
Wow.
You need to do what you need to do. Thank you very much for coming," and he walked away.
Wow.
We erupted in such glee.
Yeah.
Until it was unbelievable.
It was green light.
Because he had empowered us, saying to us that nobody's going to come on this campus and do anything to you, because primarily you are citizens of the United States of America, and secondarily students of this university.
A cause bigger than yourself.
A cause bigger than yourself. Right down the road at Southern University, where I first thought I was going to register, the president was a guy named Felton B. Clark, who was an orator like you would not believe. I mean, he would put Martin Luther King and a lot of people to shame. And Felton took the opposite approach. He called an all-university assembly and said, crying, that my mom and dad are buried on this campus. They are going to shut us down, and I'm going to have to expel all of you if you continue your demonstration in Baton Rouge.
Wow.
And he, in tears, walked away. Well, 3 weeks later, the students were demonstrating against him in front of his house on the campus, sleeping in all night long, not letting him get in or out of his own house on the campus. So the difference in approach was dramatic.
Yes.
Okay, so back to Houston. Nabrit had empowered us, and behind the scenes, the chairman of the board of Texas Southern University was a guy named Mac Hanna. Mac was didn't need any money, so Mac was pretty well established, and he had a friend, a little guy in Washington called Lyndon Johnson.
Okay. Okay.
And Lyndon
From
Lyndon was
Texas, yes.
yeah, Lyndon was the majority floor leader of the Senate of the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
And he called his friend, and they had talked about it. And behind the scenes, Lyndon had called the governor, who had called the chief of police in Houston,
Mm-hmm.
and they had decided that Houston was not going to lose any money.
Okay.
This all has to do with money.
Right.
At the same time that we are demonstrating, the space program is starting,
Mm-hmm.
and mission control is in Houston. At the same time that all of this is going on, uh, Hawthorne's is trying to open up the, the seventh wonder of the land of the world, the
And who
Dome
was
Stadium.
Hofheinz at that time?
Huh?
And who was Hofheinz at the time?
Oh, Hofheinz was the county judge of the
Okay.
of Harris County,
Mm-hmm.
and he was trying to open up the Dome Stadium and bring in baseball. So it was a whole lot of things were coming together at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And the city fathers decided that it really would be better for Houston not to become Birmingham.
Mm.
And that was the example that they used. Do you really want blood in the streets, and
Mm-hmm.
that nobody would want to come to Houston to do business,
Mm-hmm.
and that probably the team would not be located in Houston if there was this kind of unrest in Houston?
Mm-hmm.
So those business interests
Yep.
contacted Black business interests,
Yep.
people like Judson Robinson. I think Justin Robinson III is still involved in things am I right?
The
The
Houston
third is
Urban
still
League.
involved in things
Mm-hmm.
in Houston.
Yes.
And he's the Urban League. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it was his grandfather, Hobart Taylor, who had the largest franchise for the cab companies, the black cab companies in town,
Mm-hmm.
and was a big landowner, had a lot of rental property. And several doctors, Dr. J.B. Coleman and other physicians
Mm-hmm.
who were practicing medicine in the city, they contacted all of those people, and they started talking behind our backs. We didn't know that this was all going on.
Mm-hmm.
And the decision, and Quentin Meese, the fellow at the YMCA, was involved. I think Quentin orchestrated us to use the YMCA as our headquarters,
Okay.
because that's where we were having our meetings for free, and that's where we were doing our organizing. So I think Quentin wanted to have his ear to what we were doing through L. Drury Stearns and the fact that we were meeting on his property. So one day when there was going to be a huge rally and parade for one of the astronauts who had just gone into space,
Mm-hmm.
in downtown Houston, we thought that this was
And this is going to be televised, right?
this was going to be it was going to be televised
Mm-hmm.
worldwide, because nobody had ever done this before.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought that this was the perfect time for us to demonstrate. We had made all our signs. We had figured out how to get them all under our coats. And just at the proper time, we're going to whip out our signs, and dramatically we would be on television nationwide or worldwide, and we would show Houston up. Well, that same morning, word came down to Mr. Meese, tell them to call their demonstration off, because we're integrating all of the restaurants in the city of Houston.
Wow.
That
And that was
shut it
something
all
y'all
down.
were fighting for. Yeah.
It shut it all down.
Yeah.
Now, hotels had not been integrated.
Okay.
Uh,
Were
the
y'all
mo-
disappointed to have that demonstrative opportunity taken away? Or were you excited that it actually, the work that you've been doing started working?
I know that this is a podcast, but we were pissed.
Tell the truth.
You got to tell it
On
like
this
it is.
episode of Tell the
Tell
Truth.
it like it is. We were angry because we wanted to have our show on national television.
That's right.
Well, that was over because they had really cut the rug out from under us.
Yeah.
And but it
And
really was
they
not
meaning
over.
the white business community and
Had
had made
coalesced.
a deal with the black business community
Right,
to make
exactly.
sure that you guys did not. In other words, you guys were kind of what they were going to unleash if they didn't adhere to that deal or bargain.
we we were the bargaining chip
That's right.
that we could have turned Houston into a bloody mess
That's
if
right. Which is
we would have shown
exactly
up
what
with
they
our
wanted to
signs,
avoid. Mm-hmm.
and the thugs would have come out of the woodworks to
Mm-hmm.
try to stop us from doing what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this stopped the first phase of our involvement, but
Okay.
then we realized that there were things like the Union Station coffee shop, which was involved in interstate commerce, which had not been integrated. There were the movie theaters.
Mm-hmm.
There were the hotels that had not been integrated. So we realized that we needed to broaden our thought process
Mm-hmm.
into trying to integrate the rest of that stuff. And the next level was the Union Station coffee shop. Um, Again, I took a group of, I guess, 20 or more people down to Union Station coffee shop, along with Drew and others.
Mm-hmm.
And we, on one afternoon, walked in and and tried to occupy the seats. They knew we were coming because we had called the press, and the police officers stopped us from walking into the coffee shop at the Union Station. And the policeman said, "Who is in charge?" And someone pointed to me. And I said, "I'm in charge." And the guy said, "Arrest him." And they picked, I think, eight or 10 of us, and they arrested all of us.
Mm.
Well, that was my first arrest. And I think now back on it that that was a badge I should wear all the time on my clothes, that I had my arrest at Harris County Jail. I was arrested, and um, we we were we were booked and fingerprinted and mugged and the whole 9 yards.
Mm-hmm.
And but we sang our way to Harris County Jail,
Okay.
and we sang our way while we were being booked. And we had all those great freedom songs back in those
Mm-hmm.
days.
Mm-hmm.
And we shall overcome. We shall overcome ourselves all the way into the cell. So by the time we got to ourselves, we were somewhat celebrities.
And they wanted y'all to overcome.
They wanted us to overcome. Well, we were gotten out within 3 hours,
Excellent. Okay.
and we were jubilant.
Yes.
George Washington Jr., who was our attorney, and Hamer King, who was Otis King's brother, were the two
Okay.
attorneys that got us out that night. And everything was kind of going honky dory, and but we were charged, and we had to go to court
Mm-hmm.
because we were charged with unlawful assembly. And when it was time for us to go to court, um, um, we were supposed to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and George Washington Jr. and Hamer King did not show up. The seven of us, they severed oh, by the way, we had gotten Rice University students to join us.
Mm-hmm.
So they severed the cases between the white students and the black students. So they were going to try us separately.
Hmm.
So there were seven of us, black students, and I think there were four white students. I wonder why they would do that.
Hmm.
Anyway, um, we um, we were standing in court waiting for our attorneys to show up, and they didn't. And the Judge Duncan called the court to order and says, "Where are your attorneys?" And we said, "We don't know." This is before cell phones. We couldn't figure out where they were. And he slammed his gavel down and put us all in jail.
Wow.
Well, I thought, like the first time, I'd be out within 3 hours. And again, we whistled our way and hummed our way all the way to our cells. And at the old Harris County Jail, which was not air conditioned, by the way,
In
um,
Houston.
there were 8 inmates to a cell. There were 8 cells to a cell block. And then on the other side, and there was a commode in the middle of that, so you did your business in front of everybody. And then on the other side there was a dining hall. And by the time we got there that night, the cell block that they threw us in was completely filled. All of the beds were filled, and we slept. We were given mattresses, and we slept on tables in the dining hall,
Wow.
or thought we were going to sleep on tables in the dining hall. Um, 3 or 4 hours in, the baddest guy in the cell block, multiple murderer,
Mm-hmm.
organized a meeting. And he said, these boys have been doing this for us, and we are going to give up our bunks for them.
Oh, wow.
And he pointed to you and you and you, and he went right down the line with all 8 of the cell blocks. You and you take a mattress and go and sleep on a table, and they will take your bunk.
Mm-hmm.
So even in jail, there's a pecking order, and if you sacrifice, people will respect that pecking order,
Mm-hmm.
because he was the guy who ran the cell block, and he told them to get out of their bunks so that we would have a place to sleep for the whatever time we would be there. Well, it turns out that we were there for about 7 days, the
Mm-hmm.
longest 7 days in my life.
Mm-hmm.
The first day I thought we'd be out in 24. The next day it didn't happen. About the third or the fourth day, I was writing letters to my parents, and I was distraught. And I remember this. I happened to be in the cell block with this guy who was the baddest guy in the cell. He 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 pulled me on the side and he said, son, listen to me. And I said, yes. He said, do your time. Don't let the time do you. And he reached behind him and stuck between the bars. He had a whole bunch of books, novels. And he reached and gave me 3 or 4. And he said, sit down and read these. Don't be distraught. He said, you're in here for a cause. And you just make yourself happy until your cause is achieved.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, that was, like my dad pulling me aside, and like the Dr. Neighbor giving us the go ahead to do what we needed to do. That was the soundest advice I could have received, because I did my time in the way that it should have been done by not getting myself upset and distraught.
Mm-hmm.
And bottom line was that we got out in a few days, and what they were trying to do was raise enough money to pay all of our fines and to get us all exonerated from all these charges. But we didn't know that, and
Yeah.
nobody came and told us that. And they needed us in jail in order for them to raise the
Yeah.
money on the
Raise the money.
outside.
Got it.
Yeah.
So then, okay, there was a point in the movement where you get discouraged, and there was someone that we all know, obviously not personally, but Dr. King, who gets involved in this story. So tell us, how does how do you get to from the point of being in jail? So you got arrested, you went to jail. How do you go from there to talking to Dr. King?
Well, I was fortunate enough when I was 7 years old to go to Y camp, and my junior counselor was a guy who nobody knew then, named Andrew Young. And you don't think anything about that, but Andrew Young and I became friends.
Mm-hmm.
And when I looked up, Andrew Young was an aide to Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
And when we started having some problems because Mayor Tureaud, who was a Mississippi-born mayor of the city of Houston, uh, who had run on a segregationist platform, Mayor Tureaud decided that he was going to form an interracial committee, and that committee was going to make these black kids stop doing this.
Okay. This
Well,
is the mayor of Houston said, we're going to shut these black students from TSU down after I form this committee, and we are going to, I guess, have a declaration of what needs to be done with regard to desegregation.
right.
Okay.
And it looked like they may be successful because of the fact that I thought that maybe they had co-opted some of us and that we were going to get pressure from the black community for us to stop our movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so in one of our meetings one night, I said, I know Andrew Young, and Andrew Young is a friend working for Martin Luther King. I may be able to call him and see whether we could get some adult supervision for our movement. And everybody said, "Ooh, that's a great idea." Yeah. So Al Drury had an apartment that had 2 bedrooms, and he had, nobody had separate phones back in those days, so he had a line that you could pick up in either one of the rooms, and so we went to his apartment, and I called Andrew Young, and Andy said, "I will give you a number and a time to call, and Dr. King will talk to you." So I waited for the appropriate time and moment, and I called Dr. King. And this is like calling God,
Yes. Yes.
This is heavy. So I called Dr. King, and El Drury got on one phone, and I got on the other. And for 20 minutes, we explained everything, soup to nuts.
So you pouring your heart out to Dr. King.
We were pouring our heart out because we wanted him to get on his horse and ride to Houston.
Save Houston.
With the posse,
save the students, save Houston.
With the posse, he was going to solve our problems for us. We needed some real adult supervision.
Yeah.
Well, he listened and listened and listened. And when we were through, I paused, and El Drury paused, and he paused. And all of a sudden he said, "I'll tell God about it." Well, when somebody like Dr. King says, "I'll tell God about it," you say, "Damn, I lost that battle,"
So wait a minute. So let me just make sure I understand. You were on the phone with Dr. King for 20 minutes.
Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes. Pouring your heart out. That's right. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
We done called God already,
And you're pouring your heart out. And he is the all-knowing civil rights leader that we all revered, or that you all revered, and that, of course, we revere today. And your only response from him was that he would tell God about it.
He said,
"What happened in that moment? Did your jaw just drop?"
"I will tell God about it." Well, what do you say?
Right, because you don't want to say don't tell God about it, or you don't want to be someone who doesn't have faith. But you also wanted to say, "And what else?" Right?
So we said, "Thank you, Dr. King." And we hung up the phone. And he walked in the other room, or I walked in the other room, and I said, "Damn, he gamed us."
Oh, man. And so y'all were heartbroken.
Well, within a week, things started coming together.
So maybe he did tell God about it.
And within 2 weeks, our problems were nearly resolved.
So within 2 weeks' time of you calling Dr. King, and him telling you he would call God about it, and then in 2 weeks, within that time frame, the issues were basically resolved?
Well, I don't know whether he had a telephone that could reach God.
Maybe he had a direct line you didn't know about, and he used it for you.
He told God, something happened, and our problems went away.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Well, fast forward, I'm elected. And I get the call from Andy Young this time, because Andy's trying to raise some money for the movement, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm
This
in the
what year is
legislature.
this? So this is after TSU.
This
You become
was
an elected state
this
legislator.
yeah, this was I think 69. When was King killed?
68.
68. So this was 67. This was
Okay.
67.
Okay.
I get a call from Andy saying that they needed to raise some money, and I said, tell me what you want me to do. And he said, well, I can get Aretha Franklin, I can get Harry Belafonte, I can get Joan Baez, I can, and they can come in and do a concert. Can you arrange for us to have a concert in Houston that would raise some money? And I said, hey, Andy, you got it. Andy called me rather and told me what he wanted, and I made the arrangements for us to have a concert. About 2 3 weeks in before the concert was to happen, um, I had Ticketron handling all the tickets for the concert,
Mm-hmm.
and Ticketron called me and said that somebody had thrown a smoke bomb into one of their locations and that they could no longer handle the tickets. So I had to back off from them sell me the tickets. I paid them for all the tickets that they had printed and bought the tickets from them, and everything was all arranged. So I said, well, we can sell the tickets. So we went to the Groovy Grill, and we went to, every place we could, every nightclub, every place to try to sell tickets. And it was about a 5,000 seat auditorium, and
So you had a lot of tickets to sell.
we had a lot of tickets to sell, and we had sold about 1,500 seats. Okay,
Okay.
so I said, you know, we're in trouble,
Yeah.
but we're going to try to do our best. So the concert was on a Saturday night, and Friday, Dr. King came in, and we had put him up at the Shamrock Hotel, and we got to the Shamrock Hotel, and
At this
got him.
time, were the hotels desegregated?
Oh, it said hotels were desegregated.
Okay.
I had gotten some cops, some local black cops, to be his protection
Mm-hmm.
because we didn't have security back in those days, and they had volunteered. So I got him a nice suite in the hotel,
Mm-hmm.
and we were sitting in the suite, Belafonte and I, and Bill Lawson, and
Wow.
a guy named 80 Marks. And I said, uh, uh, Doc, we had a problem that we need to talk about. And he said, he said, just a moment, come with me. And he brought me into the bedroom, and he said, get the guys with the guns into the hallway. I don't want them in the room with me.
Hmm.
I said, okay. So I went out and I got two chairs, and I asked them whether they would mind guarding us from the outside of the room, outside of the suite. And they said, oh, no problem at all. So they walked out to the outside. And he sat down on a chair, and we were on sofas. And I explained to him what had happened with Ticketron and the whole ticket thing. And he listened again, just like he did the first time. And when I was through with my explanation of why we had only sold 1,500 seats, he said, just a moment, we haven't done something. And he stood up, he turned around, he knelt down on at the chair that he was sitting in, and he
Mm-hmm.
put his knees on the chair. And like I am talking to you, he
Mm-hmm.
started talking to God out loud.
Oh wow.
I, being a good Catholic boy, had
Yeah.
never seen anything like that before in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked for 20 minutes. And Belafonte's on one side of me, and Bill Lawson is on the other side of me. And Belafonte's going like this, what the hell is he doing?
Mm-hmm.
And we all said, come on now, this is, okay, you didn't pray it enough, And anyway, he got through. He stood up, he turned around, he sat down, and he said, give away the tickets. And I said, give away the tickets? And he said, give away the tickets. He said, right now, what we're worried about is looking bad. We don't want to look like we were not able to fill the auditorium. Give
Mm-hmm.
away the tickets. I said, just a moment. So I stepped over to the phone. Nobody had a cell phone then. I stepped
Mm-hmm.
over to the phone and I called a lady named Pauline Kelly. And
Okay.
I said, Pauline, can we use your garage to give away tickets for today the rest of the day and most of tomorrow. And she said, you can do whatever you want to do. So I gathered people. We went over to Pauline's house and we started giving away tickets. And the next morning, I'm giving away tickets in Pauline's garage, and a chauffeur comes up, and I didn't see him. And he parks his car. He gets out. He's got his little chauffeur cap on, and he comes in and he puts the cap on his arm, and he says, "Who's in charge?" And she points to me, and he went back and he said, "I'd like to buy some tickets." And I said, "Okay. How many do you need?" And he said, "Just a moment." So he reaches in his pocket, and I open up the envelope, and I think it was 15,000
So he
on a
had
check.
an envelope with how
And
much
$15,000.
to buy the rest of these tickets? From
So,
who? Who is this again?
well, you're trying to rush me.
Oh, okay. I'm like, did I
He
miss
said,
something?
he said, my boss sent me here with this to give this to you to buy some tickets. And I said, who is your boss? And he said, John Deminel, the
The
Deminel family.
yeah. Okay.
Okay. So he gives me the check, and I said, just a moment, let me gather the tickets. And he said, no, Mr. Deminel wants you to give them away.
Wow.
Those were the words that Martin had
Listen.
said to me the day before, give them away.
Yes.
So now our
Wow.
mission was to just give the damn tickets away because
Literally give them away.
because we just wanted people to come and we just want everybody to enjoy the concert and what have you. Now, I'm not saying that I saw a miracle,
Mm-hmm.
but I am saying that I saw that and
Wow.
it felt like a miracle.
Wow. That's a powerful story. And two powerful stories of Dr. King. Now, how many people can say they have that? You had a
Uh,
very successful journey in terms of being an advocate, an activist, a student civil rights leader who also was really embracing of Dr. King's movement for nonviolence. And you were able to do so successfully on campus. How did you then transition from being a civil rights leader on campus to actually then serving the public as an elected official? And what advice do you have for people who are looking to really transfer those skills into their life of service?
Public service is one of the most noble things that one can do. It may not pay the most amount of money, but it's so satisfying when you know that you can help people
That's
and
right.
that what you do makes a difference in their lives, not
Mm-hmm.
only their lives, but the lives of their children.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it was kind of ingrained in me to do public service.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got out of school, I went to work for the Savings and Loan Association that was owned by Mac Hanna, the guy who I just mentioned as the chairman of the board. And I had a savings and loan on Lyons Avenue in downtown. I mean, in Fifth Ward,
Mm-hmm.
and redistricting was about to happen. And an attorney friend of mine said, "Would you ride with me to Austin? Because it's going to be a long ride back tonight because the hearing starts at 7, and it's going to be nighttime before we coming back." He said, "I need you to help me drive." Fine. So I rode with him to Austin, and there was a big hearing that night on redistricting.
Mm-hmm.
And the question whether they could create single member districts for the House of Representatives. And Bob Eckhart, who was the member of the state house, was arguing and had drafted a bill to create single member districts. Well, he fought valiantly to try to get that to happen, but he had to compromise, and the compromise was that 6 of us would run as a at large in a congressional district. So that was the step two of that was step one in order to get to single member districts. So he created the possibility of six House districts inside of one congressional district, but we would all run at large.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I came back. I sat in the chamber that night, looked at what was going on, looked at the ceiling, thought about it, and I came back and laid in my bed that night and said, I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
And when the filing deadline came for individuals to file for the legislature, I collected some money from a few of my friends, filed for one of those House seats, and by George, I won it.
Not as part of the original plan, but as something that you, when you thought about the opportunity when it was presented, you decided to pursue it.
Right.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for your leadership, not just in terms of your work as a student activist, but your work as a state legislator and as a leader across this country in issues relating to justice. And I want to thank you for sharing these amazing stories. I could talk to you all day, but we don't have the ability to do that. But I thank you for allowing us to just have a sneak peek into the work that you did to make sure that you were creating a community that wasn't just better for yourself, but was better for the people around you and for generations to come. And so thank you again.
Amanda, can I put in one little commercial?
Sure.
I have a book coming out.
Okay, tell us about it.
And the book is called From Behind the Screen.
Okay.
The screen is what divided the white people from the black people on the bus or the streetcar in New Orleans. And if you Google Curtis Graves From Behind the Screen, you will see on Amazon or wherever you Google it, that it will be out in April.
Okay.
And
excellent.
I will have several places where I'll be signing books in the Houston area as soon as it comes out. If the Klan don't get me and the creek don't rise and the virus don't get me, you'll be able to come out and get a book called From Behind the Screen, which tells the whole story.
Now I'm only going to get it if it's signed.
I will sign it.
Copy. Okay.
I will sign it.
Very good. Well, of course, I'll be excited to get a signed copy of the book, and make sure you get yours as well. So everybody out there, it's available on Amazon in April. Is that right?
Right.
In April. So just stay tuned, look out for it. And again, I cannot thank you enough for being such a wonderful guest on the Edwards Empowerment Talks. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
I would like to extend a special thank you to the Texas Signal for its support of our podcast.